Hello friends, my name is Ness, and today I'm going to be doing some mini reviews of books that I recently read. First up I have Burn by Patrick Ness. This is a YA fantasy in an alternate world where dragons exist. We follow our main character Sarah in a small town in the US in the 1950s, and she's shocked when her father decides to hire a dragon to work on their farm, though her father does warn her to stay away from this dragon. The dragon ends up saving Sarah and her friend from the racist local deputy, and as Sarah gets closer to the dragon, she finds out that she's part of a prophecy that involves the dragons and a dragon-loving cult and an alternate universe. This book is a lot. The premise itself was like a little bit wild, and I was super interested, one, because of the dragons, but also I wanted to know how all of these different pieces were going to come together, and unfortunately the answer to that is that they don't. I have a pretty positive relationship with Patrick Ness. The books of his that I've read so far have all been 3 or 4 stars with a couple notable exceptions. So his books tend to be really solid for me, middle of the road to solid, with writing that I generally appreciate. I'm attracted to Ness books because I think that his premises are always really interesting. So even if the story doesn't work for me necessarily or kind of is middle of the road, it's like a really hooking premise with writing that I find dependable. And that does describe Burn. Interesting premise, engaging, dependable writing. However, it was also confusing and convoluted. The thing that I kept coming back to as I was reading was that I didn't really understand what the point was here. And not that everything has to have a lesson, but I do think that every book sort of has a point or a thing that it's doing, whether that is a plot driven book or a character driven book or a snapshot in time or something where you can say, okay, here are sort of the parameters of this book or the stories it's attempting to tell, or this is the main idea of this book. And I feel like I never got to the main idea of Burn. I didn't understand what exactly Ness was getting at. There were some smaller moments that had themes or commentary that I thought were cool. So one is that we head to this alternate version of their world where dragons don't exist. And so you kind of get this idea that in one world, dragons are kind of external, they're their own creatures, but in this other world, there are people walking around who are dragons on the inside, and I thought that that was kind of a neat thing to compare to each other. Also, our main character is biracial, and so she's in a small town in America in 1956 or 57, so racism comes up specifically because of this one character, the deputy, who is a racist, and reading about it was really uncomfortable. On the one hand, it was uncomfortable because it was explicit racism, and that sucks to read about. I'm not saying that you can't put that in books, but I'm just saying anytime I read it, it's gonna be this sucks to read. So it sucked on purpose because of the subject matter and what it was attempting to do, but also part of the story was told through the point of view of this racist deputy, and that made me uncomfortable for different reasons, especially because what I think that we kind of came down to about him and his character is that he was angry. He was upset. He was upset at life, and it sort of continued on or manifested in this racism. And fine, that's commentary that you can make, and it's fine and probably true that a lot of racists are angry. It's difficult for me to put into words why exactly this just rubbed me the wrong way, but it did. There were also points in the story, 1 or 2 instances where Ness compares the experience of the dragon and them being isolated and cast-offs to the experience of Black people in America in the 1950s. And this is something that happens a lot in fantasy, but it is a trope that I personally really don't like to read about, and that makes me upset when I encounter it. So, this entire idea that people of color are represented in fantasy by creatures and aliens and things of that nature, they are the marginalized or the mythological creatures, is just, let's move on. Let's do something new. We get it. I think that fantasy can be better about the way that it explores people of color. So that was all really negative. When I finished reading this book, I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, but with more distance and in retrospect, I feel the things that I thought were good about it, the positive end of that, doesn't really outweigh the negative end of this. So the good things were that I was engaged. And so what ended up not working at the end, like all of the different pieces, actually made it really easy to keep reading, because every time a new element was introduced, I was like, well, that's cool. And I just wanted to keep reading. So I was engaged. I was interested. There was a character who was in the dragon loving cult that I thought was really interesting, especially because we kind of got to take a look at like how he got involved in that and sort of like the narrow-mindedness of like believing in his mission the way that he did. That was pretty interesting as well. The dragon was cool. It was just sort of like grumpy and cool like a dragon. So those were the positive things. But as you can tell as I'm talking about it, they were sort of weaker overall than the negative things. So I think I would give this more like a 2.5 out of 5 stars. It was fine. Next, I have One to Watch by Kate Stayman-London. This was a book of the month pick for me, and it is an adult romance about a plus-size blogger who kind of goes on a rant about the lack of representation on a bachelorette type dating show, reality TV show, and so she gets picked to be the next bachelorette. We get to watch her kind of behind the scenes go through that experience. I read a lot of reviews after I was done reading this, and I think that people are split on the representation, the fat rep in here. I think that really the key thing to understand here is what kind of book it is. When you read the description, it reads like a book that probably has a more confident main character, or a character who's kind of gone further along in sort of like their journey of like body acceptance or whatnot. B has a measure of self-confidence. I mean, she has enough confidence that she's going to go on TV and be this personality in front of millions of people. But being put in that situation really helps her to understand and see that she has some internalized fat phobia. So this is a story about a character sort of going through that journey of like unpacking internalized fat phobia. And not only that, but I think the thing that I really enjoyed about her arc is this idea that she starts at the beginning thinking that she's looking for somebody to look past her body, and then realizing that that's not correct either. Why would she need somebody to look past her body unless something was wrong with her body? And there's nothing wrong with her body. So I thought that that arc was really interesting, but that might not be a story that you're looking for. Sort of beyond that, I thought that there were 1 or 2 things that were like included that I wish they weren't. There were things that are either like stereotypy or that don't exist in a vacuum. So sort of play into larger ideas or things that we've seen over and over again with fat characters, things like eating habits and things of that nature. They were just kind of like, okay, like you didn't need to include this, mostly because of how fat characters have been treated in media like historically. I personally really enjoyed B as a character. She makes some bad choices and she gets in her own way a lot, which is something that some readers might not enjoy, but I felt like I understood her. I had sympathy for her. I understood her decisions. So even when she was making the wrong ones, or she was like getting her own way, like I understood her motivation and where she was coming from. She takes this giant leap of putting herself out there, but then being in that situation makes her realize like all of the other things that she has to kind of confront or deal with, including coming to terms with like conventionally attractive men wanting to date her, but also like they're in a reality TV show, so what's real? And those two like warring things were really interesting, and that is a large part of what I enjoyed here was the reality TV aspect. I don't watch a lot of reality TV. I watch like Great British Bake Off and The Bachelor. I do watch The Bachelor pretty regularly. I've been watching it for so long now, and it has definitely become more of like a communal watching thing, more than just me like wanting to watch it. I never watch it by myself. It's something I watch with my sisters, and there's like this whole like online, you know, live tweeting sort of thing. It's definitely this thing that is about watching together, at least for me. I think that for people who don't watch The Bachelor, or for people who are trying to kind of capture what makes The Bachelor work or successful, you can kind of miss some of the elements. I think that London captures a lot of them. I think that she did a really good job sort of taking the 2 elements of something like The Bachelor, which is that it is ridiculous and in no way like real, I guess, and you know, all of what comes along with reality TV, but also like the hope hidden behind it or underneath it that it could work and somebody could fall in love. And capturing that in a romance book I thought was really neat. It also is a trope that I love in romance in general, which is kind of like, you know, a work within a work, or the art. So anything that has to do with like TV or writers or stage plays or anything like that as like a setting or a backdrop to a romance is like a check in my box. So that did this very well. Besides B, there were some like problems with like the characterizations, but again, it fit in. I think that contestants in reality TV tend to be these over exaggerated forms of their personality, and we get that here in this book. There were even moments when I was like, who's this guy again? Which is definitely an experience that I have had watching a dating show like this. It works better in an actual TV show than it does in a book, however, or maybe like my mind is more conditioned to accept it in like a reality TV dating show, whereas in the book there were times I were like, who is this? And it was more of a negative feeling for me. As I said about like the communal watching thing, another thing I really liked about this was that we did get snippets of like forums and like blog posts and a podcast all around people watching the show. And I thought that that inclusion again captured something essential to a sort of reality TV dating show, but that they were hilarious, especially the podcast. I just had so much fun reading them. I thought that they were really funny. So overall, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Shit Actually by Lindy West, and this is a collection of essays. I listened to this on audiobook, and it is narrated by Lindy West, and I got a copy of this through Libro FM's ALC program, so I always give them a shout out when I listen to one of these audiobooks because their service is just really great. The ALC program is kind of like arcs of audiobooks or whatnot, so I got a chance to listen to Shit Actually, and I really enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it both of Lindy West's other collection, 2 other collections of essays. Those were more about online, being online, creating content online, media, and politics, and these were commentary essays about movies, popular movies from the 80s, 90s, and I think early 2000s. And I talk about Snark Squad all the time on here, but that is like essentially what Snark Squad does, is sort of like recap and comment on things in a hopefully humorous manner. And that is very much in line with what Shit Actually is. She basically looks at movies that were favorites of hers growing up or that have like a high place in pop culture. And then she asks, are they good? And she kind of talks about what happens in the movie with like a very heaping helping of snark, and I just cracked up. I laughed out loud throughout this whole thing. There are some people who cannot read commentary like this unless they've like consumed the work, but I'm not like that. Even with BookTube, if a booktuber that I really love has a review for a book I haven't read, I will still watch the review because the review is like entertainment enough for me, even if I don't necessarily have the background of the book or the media or whatnot. So even the movies that West was talking about that I hadn't watched, I enjoyed those essays, and they're all movies that have a basis in pop culture, so I had enough like touchstones to kind of follow along. West's humor landed with me like 85% of the time, I would say, with 2 exceptions. One is sort of like potty humor or like going a little too far in a joke where I was like, okay, and then it's just like a me thing personally. And the second was like there were some like race related jokes in there that were very obviously tongue-in-cheek and sarcastic and jokes or whatnot, but that still made me like, ooh, especially like in this economy. I'm not saying that they were problematic at all or anything like that, just from like a me and what I found funny sort of thing, talking about that. 85% of the time jokes landed. The rest of the time it was probably either potty humor or like racism jokes where I was like, not in 2020. No haha. It was a really good pandemic read, however. She wrote this or some of this or edited this during quarantine. So she approaches it from that like, this will be fun to do now that we're inside all of the time, is watch some old movies. And some of her experience in quarantine and like commentary about the pandemic like sneaks into the essays in really charming, wonderful ways. So I love that part of it, but I also just thought that this was like comforting media for the pandemic anyway. So it's funny, it's about movies, it's lighthearted, but it still's got its snark about like current times and politics. It was a wonderfully well-balanced experience, and I ended up giving this 4.5 out of 5 stars. Another book that I got from Libro FM is Wandering in Strange Land. A Daughter of the Great Migration Reclaims Her Roots by Morgan Jerkins. This is also a nonfiction book, and it is about Morgan Jerkins kind of tracing her family lines back to before the Great Migration and finding out more about where her family came from on both sides. And this was just really, really wonderful. It brought a lot more to me than I expected. Not only was it like interesting in terms of all of the information that she was sharing about the Great Migration, but it was also just really relevant to me personally, which I did not expect. I am Dominican, and that culture is a mashup of like Spanish and European influences, African, and the Taino people who were native to that land. So a lot of it is very complicated because of internalized racism, but also because of like stolen and lost history. It is a very tricky like place to navigate, and it is identity work that I did not start for myself until much later on in like my adult years, just because I never heard anybody talking about it, or you know, it wasn't like something that we approached or talk about. Though as I did get older, I did start to see some of that like internalized racism that can be baked into the culture, I guess. And so I started to unpack what it meant for me to be Dominican, to have Spanish and Taino roots, to be Black, and all of that. And a lot of what Jerkins is exploring in her book were things that I was just like, oh my goodness, it touched my heart because of the way that she was able to trace her family and make connections to the things that she was experiencing now, traditions that she had carried and that she didn't even realize that she was carrying, that trace all the way back to Africa, and things of that nature that just were really, really wonderful to read. My one complaint, which is again totally a personal thing, is that I prefer my nonfiction with more of a narrative bent. This followed like a logical timeline to me because she was literally taking us through her research, and what she found was very information heavy. Again, my preference is for something that tells a little bit more of a story, even in nonfiction. So overall, this was really impactful and touching. It was well done, informative, and I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Next, we have the In Death series by J.D. Robb. So I've read the first 5 books in the series, I believe. I kind of wanted to get a little bit further before I talk to you guys about them, or to figure out how I'm going to talk to you about them, because this is a 51 or 52 book series that I didn't know how far I was going to get into, but I've read the first 5, so yay me. This follows a detective named Eve Dallas in sort of like a nearish future, and it's basically her solving crimes and meeting and falling in love with like a bad boy rich guy. I think that's the basis of it. Those are the main ideas. I'm not going to talk about each book individually, but I just kind of wanted to say that I did start this series. It's a very interesting time to be reading like police procedurals and whatnot, which I have been really into this year anyway. I think that my brain wants sort of like the procedural aspect of it, and usually you get like the police attached to it, so it's like been a thing I've been dealing with. I was not convinced on the In Death series based on the first book after I read it. These are also books that started being published in the 90s, and so they read a little bit dated, even in terms of what is considered like near future technology. Like some of it is a little like clunky now, but the main thing that put me off of it was the relationship between Eve and Rourke, because in that first book there are some clear lines of consent that are crossed, and the basis of their relationship is he kind of fights her to be let into her life because her walls are up. So that whole trope of like, no, I don't want to love anybody, and he's like, you will, and he comes down very strongly in that sort of like alpha male way that just did not, it crossed some lines for me in the first book. I do really like Eve Dallas as a main character. I love her personality. It is very much in the vein of like a Kate Daniels, who I also love. So that was like a winning factor for me. And the mystery was interesting. It is focused on violence against women, so there is content warnings for that. But in general, like the way that the mystery played out was engaging. Overall, that first one was probably like 3 out of 5 stars. So I was like, but then I kept reading, and I don't know if they're getting better or if I'm just, is it like slowly wearing me down? The relationship between Eve and Rourke is definitely getting better because they're like together now. So some of that like alpha possession thing has gone away, and he is very much more trusting of her and her abilities and her capabilities. So a lot of that ick has gone away, which is great. The mysteries are what they always are. They feel a little bit formulaic, but that is exactly why my brain is into procedurals right now, is because the certainty of like that formula. And I've really enjoyed meeting and getting to know some of the side characters and seeing Eve form this little like found family. So they are getting better. That I just talked myself through that. I've been picking these up in between other things to sort of like palette cleanse and get into something that I feel like now I know exactly what to expect. So overall, probably ranging from like 3 to 4 stars kind of down the line for the first 5. They're also like blurring together. So I have to like sit down and like remind myself and review each individually, but I just wanted to say that I am reading those. And the next of these books I have reviews for already. So first is Son of a Trickster by Eden Robinson. So I've already got the review up for that. You can click on over. And in addition to that, this was a House Salt pick. So we have a live show to go along with it. After I finished reading this book, I gave it 3.5 stars, but then it lived so strongly in my feelings, and the more that I thought about it, the more I was like impressed with what was crafted here. So I ended up bumping it a whole star up and giving it 4.5 stars. I also have a video up for Piranesi by Susannah, Clarke and Palimpsest by Catherynne and Valente, which that video is more about like a single element of these stories, which is sort of like the exploration of our world through these other worlds. I really enjoyed Piranesi in general, however. I thought it was like really well written, even if at first I was a little bit confused to what was going on, but that was like purposeful because the whole thing that she's taking us through is sort of this like labyrinth, and she creates that in very beautiful descriptions and in a way that I too was like sometimes like, where am I? Along with the main character. We both do figure out where we are eventually through the reading, and this I thought was just really smart for its themes and what it was trying to say, one of which was about like the way that we explore our world and the search for knowledge and like the extrapolation of meaning from like art and things of that nature. But it was also a really interesting pandemic read because Piranesi, the main character, is in sort of like isolation and is in sort of like containment. So his view of his world and his exploration of his world felt very meaningful in a pandemic world, especially at the end as we sort of see the impact of all of that on him and how he emerges on the other side of it. Is he the same person, or what kind of person is he now, and sort of his retrospective view on what he experienced. All of it was really smart, really well done. It is a relatively short book, I guess, compared to some of her other work, but in general, and it's just something that I would like highly recommend, because even if you come out of it feeling like that was weird and I didn't like it, it's weird enough that I want to know who will like it or who will not. I ended up giving that one 4 or 4.5 out of 5 stars. And then Palimpsest by Catherynne and Valente, which I also really enjoyed and was also really weird and confusing, and it was also dense and very description heavy. And Valente just like rambles through this book. She goes off on so many tangents, especially because we're following 4 main characters. So seeing them in their real life and then in this alternate world of Palimpsest, which they all access and are trying to find their way back to permanently, all of that has a lot of material then for Valente to sort of like just kind of explore and ramble on about, but I loved it and I found my heart really going out to all 4 of the characters. There is something very melancholy, I feel like, about this book, just because it is a lot about like being alone and like pain and suffering and sacrifice to get what you want and things like that. But it is also a lot about like connection, even through like harder times and sacrifice and pain, and especially about like exploring a world together or accessing things in our world because of these connections. I gave that one 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next thing you'll see from me is probably a standalone review for A Deadly Education, which was our November pick for House Salt, and I did finish that right at the end of October, so it should be included here, but I'm going to review it sort of on its own. My spoiler feelings are already in the live show. I gave it like a 3-star, so I kind of wanted to like unpack that a little bit more and talk to you guys about what I did and didn't like in this book, so that will hopefully be next. And then a comment response video after that is kind of what I'm planning. I don't know why I'm announcing it because your girl and plans. Oh man. I've been doing monthly wrap-ups in 2020, kind of inconsistently just because of everything that's been going on, but I didn't do one for August, September, or October. So these are not all of the books that I read throughout those 3 months, but they're a good majority of them. The reason that they're not all of the books that I've read during those months is because I've not been good about keeping track of what I've been reading, which is wild to me because in years past, like, I love tracking my reading on Goodreads, and my favorite thing to do after I read a book is like run to Goodreads, mark it as read, and get my brain dump of a review out, but I haven't been doing that. I actually have to go back and look at like my library checkouts and my Kindle and my audiobooks to remind myself of the things that I've read and have it marked down. It might be something like, I don't know, 13 books. I have to like track and review and everything, but I think that these are the majority of the ones that I wanted to talk about with you guys. If you have read or would like to read any of the books that I've mentioned today, let's chat down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. Hello friends. Hello friends, my name is Ness. Another book that I got from Libro FM is Wandering into Strange Distant. How are your friend chats today? Because the election anxiety is real.